Welcome back to another episode of Think Editorial. I'm your host, Flavia Barbat, global communications consultant and editor in chief of Branding Mag. And today I have with me Jatin Modi. Welcome, Jatin, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Flavia. Glad to be on.
Now, those of you listening, you may know Jatin as the founder and CEO of Renaissance, which is a strategic partner for B2B brands around the world, really, focused very much on all things narrative driven. So you can see where my my fandom for Jatin came from, because that means both brand strategy and brand marketing. Or you might know him from his exceptionally, I would call it erudite LinkedIn posts discussing really everything from modern day politics to ancient rituals from the Far East and everything in between. And to be honest, to me, Jatin is someone that I believe from the very beginning shared a similar passion for deeply analyzing the power of communications, of language, of storytelling. And for that, I've invited him here. Now, Jatin, I'm going to start with a loaded question. Given that you spent many years, I believe more than a decade, but correct me if I'm wrong, running a brand strategy consulting company, the one that I just described. And I'm going to ask you, what do you believe is the role of brands in society today?
Well, to me, brands represent essentially a belief system. And in the human psyche, there is a limited amount of mind space that we have. And there are multiple narratives which are competing for that space. There are narratives that we believe in while being extremely conscious about them. And there are narratives that we believe in which we might not be very explicitly aware of. And fundamentally, brands are of different types. There are corporate brands and consumer brands. So Coca-Cola is a brand, and we it occupies a space in our mind. So when we think of Coca-Cola, we think of all the advertisements that they've done around happiness. Similarly, corporate companies have a narrative. So Tesla has a narrative in our mind. It occupies mind space in practically most people in the world. Depending on who you are and what you believe in, it might be positive or it might be negative. But similarly, there are so many other narratives that hold space within our minds. It could be political brands, it could be religious brands, it could be so many different kinds. How we think of ourselves and our space in society, that by itself is a branding movement. So essentially, I believe that reality is subjective to each one of us, and that reality is driven by the stories we choose to tell ourselves and the stories we choose to believe in. And brand essentially plays the role in forming, constructing, installing those stories in the minds of people. And that's the work I do.
So are we saying then that it's is the ultimate goal of a brand to instill a story that is very visible or something that actually ends up remaining more subconscious, more under the visible layers, let's say, in people, in the world, etc.? Or is it a balance of the two? And how do you really describe that to a client that, let's say, is a little bit more tangible focused and maybe wants, just to ride the trends that are visible or, kind of focuses more on one side of the spectrum that you just described versus the other?
Well, the stories we believe in don't play out in our decisions every day. They might play out in our decisions at the time of choice. So, for example, you might believe that Coca Cola will lead you to happiness, but you're not having necessarily a Coca Cola every day. But if it's a hot day in Rome and you're out in the city and suddenly you see a lot of tourists around you and you're struggling for breath, you might say, hey, this is the perfect time where I deserve a Coca Cola. Now, that narrative has been installed over time. It's taken repetition, it's taken time, and it's taken consistency. And when the moment arrives, that's when you say, hey, I gotta have a Coke right now. So similarly, the work we do it for B2B brands. And in B2B, contrary to what a lot of other people believe, is notorious for calling marketing demand generation. And people like me have never understood that because I don't know how to generate demand. I don't understand how you can do that. If somebody wants the category you operate in, they are going to buy you. And if they don't, they're not going to buy you. So if I don't want an aerated drink, there is nothing that can generate demand for me buying an aerated drink. But if I want an aerated drink at the time of choice, I remember Coca Cola over Pepsi. I will choose Coca Cola. So, similarly in B2B, our job as marketeers is to install the story of the brands we represent in the minds of the customers so that at the time of choice, when they want to buy an ERP or a CRM or a spend management system or what have you, they think of the brand that we represent as the perfect choice for them. And therefore, they're likely to choose them over the rest.
So then where is the role of, because this is interesting with demand gen, where is the role of, because you're talking about demand capture, like somebody already knows that this is something that they want, and I, with my story or with my tactics, it depends who you're talking to, I suppose, I will capture that demand that already exists. But somebody must have instilled in some way the concept that I need that in the first place. I need that category in the first place. So whose job is that if not ours? The communicators, the storytellers, the narrators, let's say.
Well, in the case, so that's definitely true for category builders. So if you're the first mover in your category and you're creating the category in itself, then you have to play a role in creating that. But you see, most companies think of themselves as category creators when they are in fact, number seven or number eight in the market. So, for example, let's say we're talking about large language models. So, OpenAI created the market, and then Claude and Grok and DeepSeek and so on, they came in and they're starting to operate in that market. So, very clearly, ChatGPT had a much bigger challenge in front of them, which was to create the category in itself. But I don't think the rest of them are creating the category at all. So what they have to do is they have to install themselves as the premier choice versus ChatGPT when you and I have to choose an LLM for our daily use. Or as the perfect choice when you and I have to choose the perfect LLM for coding or for writing or for whatever else they seek to convince us that they're the best at. Does that
Interesting.
answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think I was just thinking that it's interesting because I find that in some of the conversations that I've been in, also in B2B, there is this concept that, oh, I can enlarge the market. You know, like all of us can be educators, so to speak, and maybe I can capture. It's almost like if I think about politics, because you mentioned politics, it's a little bit like the people that are on the fence, and you're sitting there and you're like, oh, if I give them just the right piece of information, then they'll realize, not only what they're missing, but that I actually solved that problem for them. And so I don't know, it would be interesting actually to, which is not something we can really do now, but it would be interesting to see, how many brand leaders believe that the market is limited versus how many of them believe that it is unlimited and there's always other spaces to tap into that are not necessarily in the category yet, regardless of when they enter. Because I understand what you're saying, but I think there's another side to it
Well,
maybe.
I don't think that education is necessarily antithetical to playing a role in branding, in the sense that you might be educating the market about a certain facet of what your category or what your product does. And that can be the tool in order for your target market to remember you as the primary choice. But the role is to install yourself as the primary choice at the time of choosing.
Understood.
So education is a phenomenal tactic for that, right? Because you're not hard selling yourself at that moment of time. You're helping somebody out, and maybe they will remember.
Do you think that's one of the key elements? Because in my experience, education has always been one of the key elements, or let's say one of the best tools to use for that. Because you've worked, like you said, with a lot of B2B organizations, and I think the learnings are useful either way, regardless of whether it's B2B or B2C. But is education one of the things that, let's say, the brands that you were privy to used to be more successful than others when it came to narrative and storytelling and comms in general? Or are there other pieces that you would say really differentiated them, tactics that they used?
Well, at the awareness level, I definitely think education is phenomenal. If somebody is unaware of your brand, you use education in order to help the person out and then therefore ensure that your brand is known to them. But then as we go down the funnel, there are different tactics that emerge, right? So, yeah, I think the work that you do, which is helping editorial consistency, really helps in that. So, yeah.
Do you find that there is a difference before we go any further though? Is there a difference between, because I feel like these terms are used interchangeably, so maybe we just need to level set a bit. Is there a difference between, let's say, narrative, messaging, storytelling, these kinds of synonyms, if I can call them that? Maybe they're not. We'll see with the answer.
I like to deeply think about words. So, but it gets very nerdy very fast. So, I don't want to bore your listeners with,
We're all for nerdy here. We're all for nerdy.
well, I think the first thing that we have to establish is positioning. I think that's where the magic really begins, right? It's that how are you positioned in the market vis-a-vis competition? And what is that blue ocean that you can very clearly claim to not only inhabit but actually dominate? And I think that's where the magic really begins of brand marketing. Once you position yourself and then you create a narrative which can flow outward to communicate that positioning, right? Now, so that's the narrative. Now, the next sort of the consumer layer of that is the storytelling. Because I might have a narrative, but I want to communicate in a way that allows for the recipient to be absolutely open for this message. So if I give them just logic and hard facts, it's not going to work. So I want to communicate in a way that, and we all know this, that storytelling is, we love stories. And when we communicate it via storytelling, people become open, they become interested, they become curious. That's what we have. So I think all of them are very different. They serve different functions. Positioning and narrative, we don't necessarily communicate unless it's to corporate stakeholders. It's the story which goes out to the customers and the consumers. But I think that they really serve the function for corporate stakeholders to form rather than for consumers to know.
It's good that you brought up positioning, because I wanted to ask you about positioning, because I find that it's often chosen at a very, let's say, high level. And when I've been part of those conversations, what I've found is that it's always a little bit more of a white space filler rather than something actually true to the brand. Everybody seems to be finding like the space in the market that they can occupy, whether it fits or not. It's like we'll make it fit, we'll squeeze it in, we'll I don't know, round peg in a square hole kind of feeling is the vibe that I've gotten quite often, more than I'd like to admit, even with very large brands. And I'm assuming, based on what I know about you, that there is a more profound process for this, for defining that positioning. Can you tell me a little bit about how you approach it?
I think positioning marries essentially two aspects. The first is what's the belief system and the true strength of the brand in question. What a lot of brands try to do is that they try to, what you refer to, right, the sports fit of positioning. It usually happens when brands don't understand what their true strength is. And instead of understanding and articulating their positioning based on that, they are always looking at competition and they want to be similar to them or slightly different to them, but they are doing it in almost being constantly enmeshed with the thought process of the competition. When I work with founder led companies, so large founder led companies, I always say that the sliver of the founder's consciousness runs through the entire organization, which is to say that if I want to define a brand for a founder led company, all I need to do is spend a lot of time with the founder. Because regardless of what they say might be their strengths, it's what the founder believes, which gets installed throughout the company. So the first part of positioning is the strength of the company and really deeply understanding that. And then the second part is to understand what does the customer think is the strength of the company versus competition. And once you marry both of these, I think you're able to arrive at perfect intersection of what that positioning really can be. Because the company might believe this is my strength and a customer might have a completely different perception of it. So in our branding assignments, for example, we spend a lot of time with customers. And often we are asked this question when we are beginning the assignments, like, why do you need to speak to customers? Why don't you just speak to my head of sales? He's going to tell you everything that the customer tells them. It's like, because I don't know what your head of sales is really listening to. We all have our biases, and confirmation bias is a very strong one. So I don't know what they're really listening to. So I want to spend time with customers to understand their voice. And do they think that what you are saying is your strength is what they perceive it as, or maybe there's something else which is completely lost in translation.
What if those are drastically different? What if you end up having one on the inside that is completely different from the one on the outside? What happens
Uh,
then?
Well, the company is obviously winning based on something. It's just that they're scared to embrace that. Customers are choosing the company based on an entrenched strength that they have. But the company is communicating someone else in this particular example that you give, which means that company believes that this is what will help them win. So to me, that's a phenomenal case for a brand success because all I need to do is make them understand that, you know what, that's not your strength really. This is. Look at what your customer is saying. So if we can align both of them and have them communicating based on that, it's like slam dunk, man, they're going to win.
When you do positioning on the internal side, let's say, and it's an organization that is not necessarily founder led, do you believe more in a ground up approach? Like how far down do you go to see what the values of the organization are? Or do you just stick to, let's say, a higher level, smaller group of people at the top? Because I just had this conversation the other day, actually. There are two schools of thought I've discovered on this. So I'm curious what you think.
Well, I'll be very interested to know what you heard from that other conversation. My own belief is that I need to speak to at the most about 10 people in the company, depending on what the business is, which we can choose those people. And then there are customers, of course. So some of these companies it gets very challenging because they're very large. They have multiple divisions. They have multiple people doing different things. They have multiple businesses. So in that case, that number might increase. But I'm saying if a company is, let's say, between 100 million to 500 million in revenue, my number would be about 10. And, it would increase proportionately depending on their size, perhaps. So yeah, not bottom up, definitely top down. But then I would always bring in the customers and different partners to ensure that I'm hearing all their voices. What did you
Interesting.
hear?
No, the conversation was very much what you just described. So the person that I was, let's say, virtually chatting with or virtually having this discussion with said that, they don't need to hear from the head of HR or the head of finance or things like this. But I was trying to describe that in all of the work that I've done, we've found that a lot of the practitioners themselves, so the people further down, I don't like discussing this in up and down, but I feel like there's no other way. The practitioners, the people that are really, day to day doing the roles, getting their hands dirty, I find that they often are the ones that are creating what you're describing as the customer's perception of the brand. And they're also in how they approach their jobs and their activities and their roles, they are the ones that are giving some kind of uniqueness to the brand that I find it difficult to build any kind of storytelling, narrative, editorial strategy, thought leadership, call it what you will, without trying to uncover some of that. So let's say even if in the positioning and in the narrative, it's not there, fine. The brand strategy or the brand strategist hasn't done that, so be it. But then when we go do editorial strategy, if you're about to create a lot of comms and a lot of content and a lot of that is not just product and service related, you must go find those people. You must identify that uniqueness because I find that that's where it actually comes from. Because narratives being so high level, and, quite all encompassing compared to, let's say, the smaller moments, the smaller interactions that happen around the world across divisions as you described. They're more general. They're not as powerful. And then when you drill down deeper and you really go to find these people, you end up finding what makes a brand distinct. This has been my experience. So that's the little bit of the conversation that we were having, but I think he was coming at it from a higher level than, let's say, I was. I was a little bit more on the tactical side, let's say.
Well, I think I see what you mean. At least on editorial strategy, I probably am on your side on that. It helps to have people on the ground actually doing the work to actually understand their point of view. I think on brand strategy, you probably don't need as many voices because it also confuses. You need unifying messages. So I'm with you on that.
Good to know. If I ever need your support, I'll summon you in.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of discussion. really, especially due to AI, about this exact point that I just described, about how brands can discover what truly makes them unique. And is your advice or your approach this one that you just described about finding that uniqueness, or how, because you described, let's say that there's the customer side and there's the internal side. I think the customer side we understand. But for the internal side, is there an actual method or a process that you follow for arriving to the point of saying, okay, this is the narrative. This is the okay, if it's founder led, you spend time with the founder and it's more of an observational approach, I suppose, from what I understood. But when it's a group of people, are we just having discussions? What are we looking at? What are we looking for?
Right. So it depends on the stage of the company, Flavia. And maybe it helps to just go a little bit deeper into this to understand how I see this. I think when a company is in a seed to series H stage, I don't think it helps to bring in a branding company like mine to help them. And this is why, because they're trying to figure out what is their product that is actually going to make them money. They're continuously iterating and they could look extremely different in 3 months from what they are today. But usually, when this company is already raising their Series B, which is reasonably larger ticket size, they've figured out a particular business model which can work, right? And they have, reasonably good revenue. And then, of course, there are enterprise companies which are much larger, which are very clear about their business model. Regardless of whether they are founder led or they have their CEO or professional CEO leading the company, the process largely remains the same. We have a at least how we work is we have a very structured process which runs over 2 to 2.5 months, and it has multiple workshops and different discovery calls that we do. It has a lot of work that these executives who are part of the branding team, we call them, have to also do. And this becomes the material for us to ingest and therefore digest and then work out something for them. At its beginning. On the sidelines, we're having one-to-one calls with some of these people as well as one-to-one calls with certain customers, but it's very, very structured. We exactly know what we're looking for in each of these calls. And yeah, so even with the founder-led company, it's not only the founder deciding because the company is already quite large. So someone has senior executives, his or her senior executives might will certainly be involved. So yeah, 2.5 months is probably what it takes for it to come out. I wouldn't recommend it for a new company. I think your question for about AI is very valid. For a new company, I think they're better served not working with a branding company, but to just work with AI and bring something out to the world because they'll anyways be iterating it continuously. And then when their business model is set up and they're very clear about how they're going to win in the market, that's when it makes sense to bring in a good branding partner. I think AI has a lot of advantages, which are phenomenal for smaller setups, for quick movement, and brand very good branding partners have a lot of advantages when it's needed to institutionalize the communication system. And that's when you need someone who's a strong partner who can understand you really well, understand the industry really well, and can challenge you consistently, which AI will certainly not do. Right.
Interesting.
So I think the reason they're called partners is that they have to be people who are able to challenge you and be able to take you sometimes into uncharted territory, which AI cannot do. So when there are a group of people involved, I think that challenge is very helpful. Right. So yeah, that's my thought. I think AI has a place. I think it really helps smaller companies. I think smaller companies were being scammed by branding companies because essentially I don't know what they did for the smaller companies. I don't think you can add a lot of value as a really deep branding partner to a small company, other than create some beautiful looking aesthetic things.
Understood. So then after let's say you've defined the positioning, you arrive to the narrative. I'm assuming while positioning is singular, storytelling is multiple. Then you're at the point where you find multiple stories. You find, is this what you mean by also uncharted territory? Is it also about the tactics that you then used after, you've built the strategy and you end up going into the actual marketing bit, into the rest of the method, the rest of the approach, the rest of, going to market with that new narrative? Is that where you find you're pushing organizations the most to do things differently from what they were doing before?
Now, I would say the challenge really comes, the challenge that we want to pose to our clients is usually during the positioning stage. That's where it's most critical that they get it right. And it's also oftentimes you're working with people and their belief systems. These people are obviously experts in their industry. So imagine the challenge that anybody from the outside coming in has in order to question them. Right. So I think that's the confidence and as well as the expertise that some of our client partners really look for. It's like, hey, you're coming in from the outside, but bring me an outside in view, which can add value to my life. So it's
Hmm.
not challenge just for the sake of challenge as well, right? I think on the positioning and narrative is set, I think storytelling becomes much easier. Because once we are agreed on the course of action, right, we know which side the boat has to go. You know, we can adjust how fast we want to go or how slow we want to go. Or we want to go on a sailboat, on a mechanized boat, or on a whatever boat, right? We can figure the tactics out. I think to me, if the brand is clear, the storytelling becomes really powerful and easier to execute. And there is not so much challenge then. But if the brand is unclear and just trying to sound sophisticated and fancy, but it is really does not is not rooted in truth, reality, and its true power, then I think the storytelling becomes very convoluted because you're always not sure of what you're saying. You're looking at competition too much. You become literally obsessed with competition.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you there. I mean, anybody who's ever really heard me speak knows that I'm not a very big fan of competitive strategy, of looking at the competition, of so I like very much what you're saying because it sounds like a lot of deep internal work, first and foremost, a lot of value driven, like you say, belief system work that ends up coming to the outside and then making it infinitely easier to tell the right stories. This is a beautiful narrative in and of itself, and one that I agree with because we both know, that storytelling is incredibly powerful. I'd love for you to talk about the power of storytelling, actually, even if you just what makes it so impactful, what makes a good story. These are the kind of questions that I also want to hear you answer. Because you talk,
But
about the subconscious mind,
yeah,
about these stories taking space there. And
yeah, I
it
think
can't be all just a matter of perception. There must be something more or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's more than that.
well, I think the first thing which immediately pops out to me is that storytelling is about emotion. When we think about human beings, and especially corporate executives think about other human beings, especially in B2B, where we think about other human beings who are C suite, customer is C suite, a CFO or a CIO or a CTO. We think of middle aged people who are really strong at logic, making decisions extremely logically. And we think, hey, all we need to do is throw logic at them and they'll buy us. So I think the challenge is that we forget our fundamental human nature is that all of us, we believe in stories. We take decisions based on stories that we have told ourselves that are installed in our minds. So, for example, let's think about Tesla for a second. Now, I don't know what you think about Tesla, Flavia, but I can promise you, you either love it or you hate it, right? And all of it is a story, isn't it? It's either because you love Elon Musk or you hate Elon Musk, right? Or it's because you love EVs or you hate EVs, or you love green energy or you hate green energy. Now, for a lot of people, now this is what happened in the US recently, is that the people who loved EVs and who believed in climate change fell in love with Elon Musk, but then suddenly they're not sure if they love Elon Musk at all. So their entire story about Tesla in their minds is so convoluted right now. They don't know whether they can believe it or they can't. This is a real time example of how logic does not work, right? This, people burning Teslas in the US or saying, I'll buy BYD instead of Tesla, which I don't understand how that is a better decision for Western interests, right? Of buying BYD versus a Tesla. But it's because of the stories we're telling ourselves is all this convolution, right? Earlier the story was much clearer. It was much cleaner. It's like, yeah, I believe in climate change. It's irrefutable to me. Therefore, I must choose EV cars if I can. And Tesla makes the best EV cars. Elon Musk is a genius. All these things checked out. Now that is all convoluted. Now, anybody who's buying a $35,000 to $50,000 car is probably reasonably decent at logic, right? But they're not buying based on that logic. They're buying based on emotions. So Tesla is a perfect example of that. It's not a bar of candy, it's not a bar of chocolate or a piece of candy that they're buying, right? Which is completely emotional. It's 100% emotional. There's no logic to it, right? I don't know why I like Toblerone versus Snickers. I just do. So I've created some logic in my mind to convince myself that I'm a logical person. I like Toblerone because I like the nougat flavor or whatever, right? But Tesla is a logical decision. You got to buy a $50,000 car, you got to keep it outside for the next 5 to 7 years. It depreciates really quickly. It's going to drive your whole family all the time. So you better be taking a very logical decision. But turns out you don't. So it's the same with B2B. Storytelling is the vehicle for us to create perception and emotion in the mind of our customers. As an example, Salesforce played this really well. I think Salesforce was an excellent storyteller back in the day, where they said it's the end of software. And this was back in the time when cloud was just taking off, and Salesforce just kept on talking about the end of software and the rise of the cloud. And they became, if you remember when cloud was just taking off, people were really scared to go from on premise to the cloud because they were thinking, hey, my data is going to be somewhere where I don't know. I don't know who's going to be looking at my data. It's not anymore in my office basement. I don't own the servers, right? I don't own my data anymore. How can I trust this company? Well, turns out now everybody is on the cloud. So Salesforce is on the cloud, OpenAI is on the cloud, SAP is on the cloud as well. SAP was famous for never wanting to go on the cloud. And even they're on the cloud now. So how did that emotion come about? How did cloud become something which was untouchable to something that became embraced by all? It's an emotion. Now, is it more secure? I don't know. Is it less secure? I don't know. What's the logic? Of course, there must be a lot of research which can prove it either way, right?
Mm.
Is it more expensive or less expensive? I don't know because I've seen research which point to both directions, right? So it's all beliefs.
It's so interesting because it means that, yeah, but then, we reach a little bit of the classic discussion, about, are we here to convince or are we here to be authentic? Are they mutually exclusive? Are they not? If it's all a matter of perception, then because this is what gets us in trouble in the first place, not us, but I mean, let's say the advertising, marketing, call it what you will, branding industry as a whole, for those that are not inside of it, this is what gets us in trouble in the first place, is this subjectivity. It's just like, oh, we can convince people one way or the other. It can be true, it can be not, it can be exactly what you described. And so, is it all a matter of perception in the end, or can brands truly be authentic? It's
Well, I think them being authentic and you choosing to believe what you choose in are two different things.
Mm.
So, them being authentic is that they say the truth in what they believe in, but it's also a belief, right? They choose to believe in the data the way they want to believe in. It's also a belief. So, they have chosen a position on what they believe in and they want the world represented in that reality. That's authenticity, right? And you can apply this to any institution, whether it's political, religious, corporate, consumer, brand, chocolate, anything is the same. And then the fact is that this is this particular principle applies to everyone who consumes pretty much anything. And our industry, I mean, of course, the unfortunate part is that we have helped a lot of companies create, as well as a lot of special interests create narratives which are absolutely false, and people have been lied to and all that kind of stuff. So for example, the tobacco industry convinced the whole world pretty much that it's great to smoke, there's no problem. So people were out there puffing out in hospitals and in offices and in airplanes, and you could have a pregnant woman next to you and she would have no choice because she thought that's cool, that's all right. So there have been all of these kind of things which create the lack of trust, and that kind of deceptions, those kind of deceptions are still in play. Not necessarily for tobacco as much, but for so many other things. For alcohol, for the alcohol industry, for example, if everybody drank responsibly, which is what the alcohol industry says they would like you to do, the alcohol industry's revenues would crater by a quarter. So essentially, they would just crash. Those companies would crash. Those executives would get fired. So do they really believe that? I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's true. And then there are so many other things, like for example, with AI risk and regulation, right? It's like, I don't know what the truth is. I don't know whether AI is safe for us going forward or it's not. I've seen research which points to both things. I've seen executives in some of these companies point to both things. So, of course, there are narratives being brought about which if we get wrong, it's going to be quite catastrophic in the future. But we don't know.
It's funny that you bring up research because I've always felt like research is one of those things where it's more useful to the person conducting it than it is to the person receiving the report, honestly. Because I feel like if I haven't seen all of the results to know what I'm picking and choosing from, then I, they can make it say anything at the end of the
That's
day.
that's absolutely true.
So so why would I look at the reply? I guess is the which is not a question for now, but I'm just that's I end up there. But you're talking to me and I love the passion for the authenticity because I'm a big fan of that. I think the difficulty and you can answer this because you've worked with incredibly large brands. Let's say they are authentic. Let's say the narrative and the strategy and everything really is true to who they are and what they do, and it's one of those, ideal situations. But then you have the other component of actually communicating it across the world, across cultures, people with where, the same thing means different things. So, how do you work through that layer of the strategy?
That's a great question. I've done a lot of work on this. Fundamentally, in the rise and fall of civilizations, depending on the part of the growth curve they're on, each of those civilizations believes in different things. I went back to about the last 500 years, and I looked at three kinds of civilizations which are always in existence. There is the current superpower, all right, the declining superpower, and the upcoming superpower. So, for example, at this moment, the US is the current superpower, Europe is the declining superpower, and China, depending on who you ask, China or India are upcoming superpowers. These superpowers keep changing. So, if you go back, let's say 100 years, Europe was clearly the superpower, right? Or maybe before the First World War, European countries were superpowers. The US was the upcoming superpower. And at that point of time, Britain essentially was the superpower. And prior to that, the Dutch, who they had replaced, were the declining superpower. So each of these civilizations choose based on different core values. So, as an example, the current superpower, for them, the biggest value is innovation. So, if you look at the US, the biggest innovations over the last, I don't know, few decades have essentially come from the US, right? Whether it's AI right now, whether it's the internet, the smartphone industry came from the US. The declining superpower, the core value for them is always preservation. So that explains why EU is always busy, creating regulation. So for example, today in EU, you have to, any charger for any phone has to be USB-C, versus in the US, you can have a lightning charger for your iPhone, right? So why did the EU come up with that? And you might think, as an individual piece of regulation, that just sounds stupid. It's like, why did a bunch of people go through all that pain to come up with this piece of regulation, right? But if you extend this lens around preservation, there are so many things that they're trying to preserve. They call Europe a museum for a reason. What Europe believes in climate change the most in the world, right? They enact regulation according to that because they want to preserve the European way of life. They're scared it's going away, right? And China and India, or the upcoming superpowers, they believe their core value is is validation. So when you will see communication coming out of Chinese brands, it will almost be like it's Tesla, but at half the cost. It's like Rolex, but at one tenth the cost. So it's like validation. So they're always trying, even the way they wear luxury in China and India is very different from how people wear luxury in Europe. So in Europe, you'll find, people wearing Loro Piana, or you'll find them wearing Bottega Veneta or Brunello Cucinelli. I'm talking about a lot about menswear because that's where I understand things a little bit better. But maybe for women also it applies. But in China, you'll find them wearing Prada or Gucci, which are louder. Same with India. You'll find them wearing Prada and Gucci and Armani, which are louder, screaming out. Why? Because of this need for validation. Now, in the US, you'll find luxury being worn almost as like a personal innovative statement. So you'll have streetwear meeting luxury, undercover meeting Valentino. They had a collaboration for the US. Why? Because it's like, yeah, I want to express my innovation, who I am uniquely. And Europe is all about preservation. So you'll have hushed brands, not very loud. People will not try to, it'll be hush. It'll be a whisper, not a scream. Versus in Asia, it'll be very different. So these are some of the lenses that you use in order to understand different cultures. And then when you're making, I'm sorry, I went through such a long answer around this. But when you're making brands stand out across culture, which are global in nature, and you understand these cultural the lenses that people have, you can engineer those brands accordingly a little bit better.
I have to say that what I love about everything that you just said is that I highly doubt that any AI would ever be able to reply in that way.
You think so?
For any report for that matter, or any research report for that matter.
I don't have research for it, so these are all my own perceptions. So anyone can challenge it, and maybe I might be wrong.
But that's the beauty of it, no? Because I mean, you and I have spoken about this before, and we can tie this back to the organizations, but I know that a lot of the people listening believe in language and believe in verbal and believe in writing. And, you call yourself not a writer, but I think you're very much becoming one, as we can all see. Is there a set of values that we all share as communicators that allows us to observe the kinds of things that you're describing? Where, for example, for me as a business owner, the things that you just described, that you sat there and you studied and you saw and you looked at and you read about and you wrote about, and whatever combination of those factors led you to conclude things in this way and say, here's a piece of intel that I can bring to you about how you're going to conduct your business moving forward. I feel like this is something that is, I don't know, a lot of us communicators, we share this from what I can see. I don't know if you've observed the same, that we have this observational skill, we have this interest, that we look, that we analyze, we process, we think, we maybe a little bit more than the average. Would you agree?
I've never thought about this before, but now that you say it, I would say that a lot of communicators, they have this sensitivity that precedes perception or deep perception. I can certainly see it in you that you have that sensitivity that allows you to be open to a lot of ways of thinking, a lot of ways of. I think that openness that allows you to gather different points of view and just sit with it and not judge instantly, and therefore that allows you to create multiple narratives and really kind of think through the way the world works. So I'm not sure if I have a very strong conviction on this, but my feeling is that maybe communicators tend to have an artistic element to them. Therefore, they have this perception that allows them to see the world in a slightly different way, or they want to figure out the system that moves the world. I don't know, actually. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts?
I've noticed this. I've noticed this many times, but also, that's why I mentioned that you say that you're not a writer, but I can see that, you post insights on a wide variety of subjects: politics, isolated religions, innovative tech. I've seen you mention Marcus Aurelius, who, by the way, is one of my favorites. And I'm assuming it's an assumption that all of this that you do, just like you proved now in the entire discourse that you just had, all of these things that you study ultimately feed back into the value that you bring to an organization, the value that only you can bring. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is for anyone who's listening to show that this is a very clear example of why you are valuable and you are unique if you can harness the experiences that you have, if you can foster that observational skill. You really can bring something that is uniquely yours to an organization where you don't have to fear things like AI and stuff like that. And I guess I just wanted to hold you up in high regard to say that you've done a great job of personifying that. Um,
Thank you.
and so for this, I very much appreciate you coming on here and just showing who you are, because that's really why I wanted you to join in the first place. And you're you're a thought leader at the end of the day, regardless of what people think or don't think about that term. I really don't care. It's not important in this moment, but I think you have the qualities of a good thought leader. You lead with observation and with thought. And I'm assuming that that's what also makes you very successful in what you do. And I do want to ask you, if we have a little bit more time, I do want to ask you, what is your writing process like? You have all of these subjects that you focus on. How do you choose
Yeah.
where to dive deeper? How do you open? What is your relationship with this openly stating, your thoughts and opinions and observations online, which I know is not what you were doing before?
Right.
What has your experience with all of this been like? What can you tell us?
Well, Flavia, till the last year, I was on LinkedIn maybe for 15 years, and I hardly ever posted anything which was truly what I believed in or thought. It was more performative and decorative, which a lot of LinkedIn is, unfortunately. I was also party to that, and more noise than signal. And then at some point, I think in January last year or February last year, I decided to take a break from LinkedIn and just went off the app for 6 or 7 months. And I thought I'll never come back unless I have something very compelling to offer to the network. And I did come back in November, and that came after this branding process, which I applied to myself over several months. Also, a lot of soul searching. And other than that, I just said, hey, based on all of this, if there is, I will just write for myself. And my natural writing style tends to be a little bit poetic, and it tends to be a little bit elaborate for most people to like it. I think most people like a little bit quicker, faster, it's like bullet points, give me action kind of writing. And mine is not that. My writing, at least the kind of writing that I enjoy, is something to savor, something to taste, and then to sit with that taste and to feel that taste. And it's more sensuous. It's meant to be like that. And that's what I enjoy reading as well as writing. So I did not really think that anybody on LinkedIn would care for this kind of writing style because I don't see it practiced very often. And there was no competitive benchmarking for me to do around this. So I said, well, I'm going to write the way that I love writing. If anybody finds this interesting, great. And if they don't, at least I should find it worthy enough to reread again and again and savor it myself. So that was my intention when I came back. I think it was November of last year when I started publishing again. I've been, to be extremely candid with you, quite surprised at how well people have taken to this content. I did not expect any recipe. I mean, I did not really expect much of a reception for this kind of content coming out. Yeah, and I like writing what I write. I like reading what I write. That gives me a lot of joy. A lot of people write to me how much joy it gives them as well. I launched my Substack now just a month ago, and I think there's a beauty in that. There's a beauty in us being able to enjoy something, together.
There is no, I the reason why I ask you is because I'm wondering if you bring this back to the brands that you work with, because you mentioned the bullet points, the short stuff, the list, the fact that you didn't expect people to really enjoy something different. And I'm constantly fighting the battles with the clients that we have and the brands that we work with to say, no, listen, people really do want something more than that. You really can go beyond this obvious short listicle, call it what you will, best practice, templates, gurus, et cetera, et cetera. Like the common narrative, ironically, is not the only thing that can make you successful. Do you ever use yourself as an example for the brands that you work with to say, listen, the
Yeah.
world also wants something different. Let's try
Yeah.
something different.
My writing is exactly opposite to anything that a LinkedIn guru would tell you. It's generally close. It almost hits character limit every time. So it's 3,000 characters pretty much.
Same.
It's very difficult for me to fit it in. I don't work with any, listicle format. I don't have infographics. I don't have slideshows. What is that? None of that stuff, right? Many people of the clients that we work with, as well as all sorts of people like VCs, founders of mid and large size companies across the world, from the Middle East, from the US, from Europe, from India, have reached out to me and they've said, hey, why don't you come and do some work with us or talk to us or just talk to us about what we are doing? They've invited me for keynotes and so on and so forth. So I don't think I have a process change that I have affected because of this writing so far. I think that process by itself was very unique to us because we've never done competitive benchmarking of our process. We just do it the way we think it should be done. But around the writing specifically, a lot of people find that it resonates with them and they would like to find their own authentic voice and they would like to speak in a way that makes them feel really good about writing rather than it being a chore and them just trying to appear like a thought leader. And I think that's I enjoy that. So I think personal brands by themselves can be even more powerful than company brands. And I think the two biggest brands today in the world are personal brands, essentially, right? They occupy the most mind space in most of our heads, right? And I don't even need to tell you their names because it's most likely you're thinking of the same two people. So it's the same with company and leaders and so on. And it's just unfortunate that the way they represent themselves on LinkedIn is almost like a PR release. And I just cannot understand how they can agree to themselves being reduced as a PR exercise when there is such richness that they can add to the world, right? You and I, we should continue to fight this crusade and hopefully there will be more authenticity in the world, more ways of thinking, more divergent thought processes which can arrive on these platforms that we consume, which can allow for different ways of thinking to blossom, for people to find their own tribe in a more organic, non-manufactured way, and more ways of thinking to be espoused and believed and followed rather than just very conventional, vanilla, like do this in such a way and you'll be a thought leader. And that's just so boring. That world sounds so boring to me, Flavia, that I'd rather not have it. It's just like we gotta make something unique.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I think that given what's happening with AI or continuing to happen with AI, probably this crusade is more important, more important than ever.
What's happening on LinkedIn with AI? Oh God, it's terrible.
You're talking so much about storytelling and connection. Before we go, can I ask you, what are you feeling about AI in terms of its effect on things like storytelling, connection, society, etc.?
Well, let's cover the society bit first. There is a narrative that is told out there that AI will allow for UBI, universal basic income. And, all of us will be just sipping margaritas on the beach and AI and robots will do all the work. There'll be limitless productivity and, we can just chill and enjoy ourselves in some way. I don't know if such a day will arrive, but till it arrives, I see that AI is going to cause significant societal displacement. In my own company, we used to hire a lot of fresh grads, and I think in the last 2 years, we've hired zero, none of them. And earlier, it was maybe at least a dozen a year. So if somebody tells me AI is not causing job loss, that's just not true. That's 12 jobs that have been lost for sure. And I think there was a lot of research that came out, which I choose to believe in, is that new grads are finding it more difficult to find a job. So now if you have new grads suffering to get a job in few years, that becomes a very large problem. Let's not forget how the French Revolution came about. It was a bunch of very well educated lawyers and professionals who sat around in cafes without a job and they decided something has to be done about it. So I think that it looks likely that there should be societal disruption unless there's some angle of this which I'm not seeing. I don't believe in the angles that a lot of gurus say is like AI is not going to replace you. Somebody using AI is going to replace you. Yeah, but net total, there'll be lesser jobs, right? I don't get it, right? So that's one. I think AI writing is excellent for people who used to find it difficult to express themselves. I know a lot of people in India, for example, where whose English, who would struggle in English, and now they can communicate on emails and so on and so forth. I think that's a great benefit. There is a lot of work that I do with AI, which is really helpful to me, which I would earlier do with people. So research, for example, for my articles, it takes a hell of a long time, and earlier maybe somebody else would have done it. Now it's done by AI. So it's really useful. It's especially extremely useful for people who are rich. It's extremely useful for me. It's very useful for my company. But overall, I see that, yeah, it doesn't look likely that it's going to end well. So, as pessimistic as that sounds, that's what I believe in.
It's interesting that you brought up the example of people that weren't able to express themselves before because I was recently looking for someone to hire for a role and I got, like a very well written, I knew it was AI. As an editor, you can tell. I knew it was AI, but I said, I wouldn't be the pessimistic one that says no for the interview just because of that. It was a well written, email statement, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that we went into the interview and the person could not speak properly to me. And it was very, I have to say, it felt like a very, not just a disappointment, but like a waste of time. And I felt sorry for the person more than for, I felt almost like both of us were duped, but in different ways. Almost like a cascade of duping, I don't even know how to explain it. So it was, and I don't know, it felt, because I noticed these things and it just felt like an immediate cut of, this is why I also asked you the question, because I feel some of these moments where it just, the connection between me and somebody else is just like immediately cut. And I'm like, shit,
Yeah.
all because of this darn thing, I just get so, and I try to, you manage your emotions. You don't want to get overly angry about the things because you want to maintain some kind of reasonable assessment of what's going on. But shoot, I felt so bad, really. I felt so sorry for the whole situation. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, and this is just one tiny example in a large sea of. I agree with you that chaos will, because you mentioned it to me also before that, chaos will ensue in some way or another. I just, like you said, may we both continue showing something a little bit different also to the organizations that we work with so that, regardless of what technology they use or don't use, at the end of the day, I think the most important piece for both of us is that it's true,
Mhm.
like you said, that it's authentic. And so I appreciate you coming, I appreciate you coming to the podcast and telling your story and about not just what you're working on, but who you are and what you believe in. And I appreciate that immensely. So
Thank you, Flavia. You're an excellent podcast host.
thank you very much. You're the first one to say so. So I
Really?
appreciate it. Yeah, well, I didn't start this podcast so long ago. So
I'm surprised nobody else caught on to that. It seems pretty obvious to me.
thank you very much. You are an incredible guest, an incredible thinker, and I encourage everyone listening to go and follow you on LinkedIn. I'm assuming is where you prefer. Well, also your Substack that you started now. So please, everyone that's listening, read what he writes. He writes it with honesty, with rigor, with passion, and it's just if you want a good mind to spark your own, then I highly recommend Jatin's posts. Honestly, and anything that he produces, really, I would put my hand over my heart and say that it's probably gonna be great. So thank you again for joining me, Jatin. And
Thank you, Flavia. And now I will await news from you to come to Lithuania.
ha, yes, for everyone listening, I'm saying it now in front of all of you that I am going. I will visit. I've never been, but I will be there. So thank you very much, Jatin. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.